early hotspots, but it's been better recently. Yeah, it's been declining.
Okay. Good. So I think we are in the broadcast mode now. So the attendees are coming in. So we just give them a few more minutes before we start.
Okay, sounds good.
Hi everyone, the EcoLabs webinar will begin very soon. Please sit back and relax for the time being. We'll be starting at 9:30, so just give us another 1 minute for the others attendees to join in. All right, good morning everyone, or evening if you are in another time zone. Welcome to the EcoLabs webinar series. Thank you for joining us for today's session. My name is Ryan Jin, and I'm leading the Smart Cities and Future Mobility effort at EcoLabs Centre of Innovation for Energy, or EcoLabs for short. I'll be hosting this session. EcoLabs, jointly established by the Nanyang Technological University, Enterprise Singapore, and Sustainable Energy Association Singapore, SEAS, aims to build and accelerate deep tech energy innovation capability in Singapore to support the nation's future energy transition. This joint initiative aims to help Singapore-based energy startup and SME successfully commercialize and scale their innovation effort by providing them with the following: translational research, living testbed, innovation programs, funding partners, and community platform. As the COVID situation is still going on, we are organizing the EcoLabs webinar series to continue the engagement and interaction with our partners, where we invite industry experts to offer their insight on the respective topic on a weekly basis. This webinar series comprises of 5 themes: Startup Series, Insight Series, Corporate Series, Investor Series, and EcoLab Series, each focusing on different aspects of the innovation ecosystem. This session is part of the EcoLabs Insight webinar series to provide industry insight to understand and navigate the innovation journey in the energy sector. You will also learn about the different aspects of the startup ecosystem, market analysis, and what to look out for and where are the different opportunities. Today's webinar is part of a partnership between EcoLabs and Lux Research, where Lux Research provides targeted market briefings and market intelligence through the Lux Tech Signal. EcoLabs is happy to partner with Lux Research to bring interesting market insight and briefings to you. Based in the US with global presence, Lux Research combines deep analysis of technology with business insights to deliver independent, fact-based analysis, insight, and opinions. Today's webinar titled Mobility in a Post-COVID World, presented by Christopher Robinson, Senior Analyst from Lux Research, will focus on how the COVID-19 pandemic is impacting both the near-term and long-term outlook of shared mobility, electric vehicles, and autonomous vehicles. Chris is a Senior Analyst at Lux Research and leads the Future of Mobility program. In this role, his research focuses on the intersection of new technologies and business models impacting the way we move. This includes a focus on advancements in autonomous, electric, and connected vehicles technologies, as well as those technologies are intersecting with new business models like ride-hailing and car sharing. This focus also extends to the new modes of mobility such as Hyperloop and VTOLs. Chris has also contributed to Lux Energy Storage team focused on advanced battery technologies and electric vehicles. Prior to joining Lux, Chris worked at Prudence's Nanoscale Energy Transport and Conversion Laboratory, where his research focuses on engineering higher efficiency thermoelectric materials. He holds a BS and an MS in mechanical engineering. Towards the end of each session, we will have about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can key in your question in the Q&A or raise your hand so that we can unmute you to voice your question during the Q&A session. Now, without further ado, we would like to pass the session to Chris. Chris, please.
Thanks, Ryan. Thank you for the kind introduction, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. So as Ryan mentioned, we'll be talking about a topic that I think is in a lot of our minds, COVID, and specifically its impact on mobility. I know a lot of us are probably feeling personally the impacts of this. I know I was actually supposed to be flying to Singapore tomorrow night myself. But kind of more broadly, when we think about mobility, the space is changing probably faster than ever. If you think about autonomous vehicles potentially changing the operation and navigation of vehicles themselves through electric vehicles for the first time in the better part of a century, actually changing what is moving the wheels and what is powering vehicles. And with that backdrop, COVID's posing some new and pretty unique challenges. So as Ryan mentioned, the focus of today's webinar is really on how COVID is going to change the conversation and outlook, both short-term and long-term, for autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, as well as shared mobility. Now, Ryan gave an introduction to Lux, and it was quite thorough, but a brief note from my side. We're an independent research firm. Really, we work with clients to understand impacts and opportunities related to emerging technologies. So I lead our team's mobility research, but we also cover other verticals like materials innovation, agri-foods, energy, as well as digital transformation. And do have offices around the world. So I'm speaking to you here from Boston today, where our US headquarters is, but also have offices in New York, Amsterdam, Singapore, and Tokyo. So for today's discussion, I wanted to start with just having a broader conversation about some of the more immediate impacts that COVID has had on mobility thus far. So looking at a few data sets focused on mobility, but as I mentioned, focus a bulk of the conversation today on what the impacts, both short and long term, will be on electrification, autonomy, as well as mobility as a service, which is a term that we use to encompass everything from ride-hailing to car sharing to popular dockless scooter and bike sharing services. So starting with the immediate impacts COVID's had on mobility, Lux often gets questions from our client base that are focused on specific technology, but what is the impact of that technology on a specific world event? And as technology folks, as an engineer myself by training, it's tempting to ignore some of these factors, but the reality is global events, whether it be social, political, or economic, or the current health crisis we're in, do have a tangible and significant impact on the outlook of different technologies. But in internal conversations we've been having, COVID-19 is very different than those other disruptions that we've been speaking with clients about. It's not just another disruption. It's on a scale that we haven't really seen before, at least in our lifetimes. Some metrics, things like oil prices going negative, that's, in some respects an anomaly that has since been corrected, although prices are still very low for oil right now. But this is largely used as a corollary to the economy's health. They actually, I think there's a pretty good case to be that the oil and gas industry largely failed its stress test of decreased demand. But it's not just the metrics like oil prices. Larger macroeconomic impacts are impossible to ignore. So unemployment has spiked. This is data from the US, but this is certainly a global phenomena where the magnitude of people claiming unemployment insurance and losing their jobs is happening faster and on a larger scale than even the financial crisis of 2008. And with those broader economic trends, we're also seeing dramatic changes in mobility. So Google actually shares a lot of their mobility data that they collect through different user data sets, and anonymizes that and makes it publicly available. And looking through some of that data on a global scale, mobility around transit stations has decreased. Fewer people are riding public transit. Many large cities are seeing even more drastic reductions than the 34% listed there. It's closer to 60 to 70% in some cities. Really, subways, buses, other forms of public transit are some of the worst places to be in terms of being able to practice social distancing. We're also seeing decreased mobility around workplaces. Simply put, fewer people are going to work, and it's really unclear just how many people will return and when. So there are some uncertainties with some of these metrics. And then lastly, maybe surprisingly, mobility focused around residential places has actually increased slightly as we're just spending more time in the space in and around our homes. COVID really is an unprecedented global event with significant impacts on mobility, and there are very few aspects of the ways that both we move and the way things like parcels move. There are very few ways in which it will be unchanged. And this brings about some really tough questions to answer. As I mentioned, this is against a backdrop of a time of pretty dramatic change in the mobility sector. And so have these timelines shifted? Is there going to be a long-term change in some of the outlook of these technologies? Or even kind of separate from the outlook, who along the value chain or maybe even outside it is actually best positioned to capitalize on some of these changes? And so those are some of the questions I want to talk about today amongst these three technologies. So we'll start with electrification. Now, it's no secret automakers have been hit particularly hard with the pressures due to COVID. We've seen widespread shutdown of manufacturing facilities around the world. And in some of the facilities that have started to begin reopening at a limited basis, have even had their own struggles and even had to shut down once again as workers tested positive. So still very much in the recovery and reopening phase of automotive manufacturing. But even aside from production, demand has significantly decreased. Very few people in this environment, one with large unemployment and furlough programs, maybe don't have the means to purchase a car, but also with extensive work from home orders, a lot of people are delaying car buying decisions right now. And the situation is so dire for a lot of automotive companies that many governments around the world are starting to consider stepping in and offer financial reprieve, similar to how some regulators responded in the financial crisis of 2008. And against that backdrop, electrification is a really challenging prospect for automakers to sell right now. Electric vehicles aren't profitable to make. Yes, Tesla has achieved a few profitable quarters, does achieve a positive margin on vehicles like the Model 3. But the reality is they haven't turned an annual profit, and other automakers such as GM with the Chevy Bolt have reported basically they don't make any money on every vehicle sold, and they lose money on each. So we're still not quite at a point in time where electric vehicles are profitable to make. That's along with the fact that from a consumer perspective, they're already more expensive. And now the value proposition is hurt with cheap gasoline. So putting all these factors together, it certainly paints a very negative picture for electrification. But there's another challenge, which is the reality is electrification in the automotive sector is inevitable. And that's because of one of the most important variables, regulations. Governments are pushing pretty aggressively to reduce emissions from the transportation sector, whether it's programs at the central government level, such as the European Union's big 95 grams of CO2 per kilometer limit they're putting on fleet emissions, with a kind of soft introduction this year, hard introduction next year of that program, or others that aren't just about reducing emissions across the fleet. Some like the California Air Resource Board Zero Emission Vehicle Program, which mandates automakers sell electric vehicles, and was more or less the inspiration for China's NEV credit, which is a similar requirement. Basically, automakers face financial penalties if they don't make electric vehicles. But it doesn't just come at the central government level, it comes from local governments. A lot of cities are looking to restrict emissions or restrict certain powertrains from operating in cities related to fossil fuels. And certainly that's going to change the consumer's minds and make automakers rethink the types of product mixes that they're offering. Simply put, as a consumer, I have my own hesitations about buying a car that may not be usable in certain city centers, and I think a lot of others would as well. And lastly, aside from government regulations, I think we have to recognize that consumers are making environmentally conscious choices, and it's having a tangible impact on mobility already. What we saw before COVID really rocked the airline industry was that there already were pockets, regions and countries where demand for flights was already decreasing as really the social aspect of flight shaming and being more aware of the carbon emissions associated with flights was having an impact on consumer choices, having more people opt for other modes like rail. And so regulations do have a very tangible impact on electric vehicle adoption. And it's going to be crucial to see how governments respond to this from a regulatory perspective, either loosening regulations, providing more financial assistance toward others. Just briefly, I think it's worth taking a look at some past regulations to understand just how important this is. You know, if we look at the world's largest automotive market and also the world's largest electric vehicle market, where half of the world's electric vehicles are sold, China's had a decade of careful policy decisions, starting with about a decade ago, some pilot programs that looked at how do we incentivize vehicles, looked at a variety of different low emission powertrains before really entering a second phase of that program in 2013 when they dropped hybrids. They introduced performance criteria, things like, you know, to be eligible for subsidies, you had to have a minimum range or energy density from the battery pack to continue to spur technical innovation. All the way through, you know, sales were growing rapidly. The current phase we're in, which is the government starting to decrease subsidies and phase out those subsidies, replacing them with those penalties for not making electric vehicles. So we also looked at another aspect of regulations, which is, you know, what are common regulations in areas with high penetration rates of electric vehicles? And actually in 2019, the 3 countries with the highest penetration rate of electric vehicles were all in Northern Europe. So Norway leading the way significantly at 43%, followed by the Netherlands and Sweden. And there were 2 pretty clear policy approaches. One is there were a plethora of non-financial benefits. So you get discount or free parking, reduced tolls. In the case of Norway, you get free or discounted ferry rides for your electric vehicle. But by far the most important was high taxes and fees for combustion vehicles with exemptions for plug-in vehicles. You know, these countries, it's not just about offering subsidies for electric vehicles or direct subsidies. It's creating an environment in which there's cost parity between internal combustion engines and plug-in vehicles. And I bring this up because it is important context to understand how regulators are responding to COVID. Because early discussions on different types of relief packages and regulatory bodies are actually tying support to the industry to electric vehicles, trying to advance decarbonization. So in China's case, they were originally going to phase out regulations in 2021. That's now going to be 2023. So they've extended the period of time that offer subsidies as a way to bolster the automotive industry. In Europe, they are actually taking a page directly from Northern Europe's book, which is start to offer tax relief instead of direct subsidies to electric vehicles. And that's one of the things being discussed in Europe right now. Now, I bring up regulations first because, as I mentioned, it really is one of the strongest indicators. You know, regions that offer subsidies and have, you know, stricter emissions policies have higher rates of electric vehicle adoption. And it is encouraging to see regulators, you know, really reinforcing electrification as part of their response programs in these early stages. But it's unlikely that alone is going to overcome, you know, the challenges that COVID has placed on electric vehicles. They are, as I mentioned, still not profitable, although getting close. And consumers still have reservations about electric vehicles. So in light of COVID, how can automakers respond, as it's pretty clear they need to be selling more electric vehicles? Well, one is working on customer pain points. There are dozens of consumer surveys out there. I picked one from Consumer Reports last year that looked at US respondents that basically asked the question of all electric vehicle metrics that could be improved, what would make you more likely to buy a vehicle? And unsurprisingly, it's a combination of lower prices, longer range, and improved access and speed for charging. So automakers, as I mentioned, they haven't been profitable, but they're actually getting pretty close, and they're improving pretty dramatically in a lot of these consumer metrics. You know, really the improvements in battery technologies have been at the heart of improved electric vehicles, with nearly an order of magnitude reduction in cost at the cell level that has resulted in increased range. So automakers are using that to build in more batteries into vehicles. They're also still reducing prices, so average MSRPs have gone down in vehicles, in electric vehicles, which is really promising. But there's another challenge, which is the fact that opportunities at the cell level for future cost reductions are pretty limited, which is, of course, a really big challenge. You know, most of the cost reductions that have come from economies of scale have been exploited. The analysis that Lux has done indicates really when you build a manufacturing facility for cells beyond 10 gigawatt hours, you don't get significant benefits and cost reductions from economies of scale. So automakers, do need to continue making electric vehicles, are under significant pressure to increase profitability in these current financial stressful times for them. So really one of the responses that we think automakers are going to make is start looking more outside the cell for innovative electric vehicle technologies. They've been doing this, but I think COVID is going to accelerate specifically two trends in the automotive space that look at all of the innovation that happens in the vehicle outside of the cell. Because of course, EVs have fewer moving parts, but are by no means, simple devices. And there are a lot of components and opportunities for innovation outside of the cell. And those two trends are, first, a focus on efficiency. I know this may seem counterintuitive. We focus a lot of efficiency efforts around combustion vehicles, but as automakers strive for profitability, there are some relatively low-hanging fruit in terms of technologies to adopt to actually extract more performance from the battery pack. So I'm not just talking about watt hours per mile and how much energy you need to propel a vehicle. It's about how many miles of range you can get from a given battery pack. So whether it's things like improved battery management systems, which can help automakers use a wider window of the state of charge. So, charge up a little bit higher, discharge a little bit lower to access some of the unused capacity in battery packs. That can come from a better battery management system. Electric motors are already pretty efficient, but if you start looking at different torque and RPM requirements, you have a map of a wide variety of different efficiency measures. So focusing on motors that are efficient across a wide band of engine RPM as well as torque are very valuable. And then lastly, thinking outside the powertrain, Tesla and Nissan are the first automakers that have adopted heat pumps inside their vehicles that are more efficient at heating vehicles at low temperatures. So all those will ultimately help you either reduce the size of your battery pack or get more performance from the same size battery pack, which allows you to sell a vehicle at a bit higher of a price point, which ultimately all of this comes back to making vehicles more profitably. The other strategy that we expect to be accelerated from COVID would be a focus on platform sharing across automakers. Now, everyone got very excited about the Chevy Bolt as well as the Model 3, as specifically the Bolt was designed as really the first dedicated battery electric vehicle from a major automaker that had the metrics of more than 200 miles of range, while still at a fairly reasonable price point. But the reality is that vehicle was still basically a dedicated one-off vehicle. Whereas now the focus is on, instead of designing a vehicle, designing a platform of technologies, including batteries, motors, power electronics, on a flexible frame that can underpin anything from a hatchback to a large truck. The idea there is you can help reduce development costs for new electric vehicles, as well as actually reduce manufacturing costs through increasing the scale of production. If you're producing modules that can go in any type of vehicle, that means you're producing more modules and lowering costs. So we do expect to see more automakers sharing platforms between them. We've seen a little bit of that. So Volkswagen and Ford, as well as GM and Honda, are just a couple of examples of companies actually that have agreed to share a platform that one company developed. But we expect some of the other automakers that maybe aren't advanced in electrification to start engaging with automakers like GM and Volkswagen to have these dedicated electric vehicle platforms already designed. So to summarize some of our thoughts around electrification, we've been using a graphic on the right here that is not a quantitative analysis, it's kind of a visual representation of how we think the impacts from COVID will evolve in different sectors. So I'll bring this graphic back for the other sectors we look at. But broadly, the story of electrification is short-term. This is a negative impact. Not just EVs, but all automotive volumes are down. And automakers, as I've mentioned a few times, are going to struggle with trying to make a less profitable product at a time of significant financial duress. However, long-term, we expect things more or less to return to as normal. As automakers get back on their feet, governments have made it clear they're not going to be relaxing environmental regulations. If anything, it could be the opposite, where they provide more incentives and subsidies to electrify. So long-term, we do expect electrification to return to normal. And so, lastly, to wrap up this section, we actually didn't make any changes to our long-term electric vehicle forecasts. looking toward 2035 to 2040 as that time frame where we expect about half of the world's vehicles will be sold as either a plug-in hybrid or a battery electric vehicle, something that can charge from the grid. Electric vehicle is going to be slow and steady. There's a complex supply chain that also needs to mature along with sales. So it's not going to be the type of S-curve that's, dramatic fast adoption. And as I mentioned, we look at those long-term, 2030, 2040 timelines and just don't see COVID having a significant impact on those. So switching gears a little bit, talking about autonomous vehicles. Now my background is primarily in electrification. That is what I was doing actually before joining Lux. But I think it's difficult to say that there's anything more disruptive in the automotive space than autonomy. Just simply fundamentally changing how vehicles operate and opening up new use cases for vehicles. And like all industries, the immediate impacts of COVID were negative on autonomous vehicle development, although maybe not as negative as some other aspects. So a lot of developers are reducing headcount. So Cruise actually laid off roughly 8% of its staff, but digging a little bit deeper, this wasn't kind of core engineering functions. It was marketing and business development and those other types of functions that are more commercially focused. Elsewhere, startups are finding across the board, inside of mobility, outside of mobility, that, investors have a little bit less money to play with. And that's causing some companies to maybe seek a bit of an earlier exit than they would have otherwise. So Amazon is reportedly in advanced talks to acquire autonomous vehicle developer Zoox after they had already invested, I should say, in Aurora last year. And it's interesting, as Zoox was just as a company always probably going to need a partner just because of an automaker partner because of its approach to integrating its autonomous vehicle development with its powertrain. Whereas other automakers like Ford are actually just postponing the introduction of services based on autonomous vehicles. So Ford had been targeting 2021 launching a commercial service, so something like ride-hailing or delivery service with their vehicles, but has postponed that as they want to understand the impacts that COVID is going to have on consumer acceptance. So it is fair to say development has stalled. It's certainly harder to develop autonomous vehicles while testing has mostly ground to a halt, although that's starting to start up again. And it's much more challenging to build an electric vehicle when you're working from home. But there are some aspects of autonomous vehicles that are really important to think about during COVID. So, I don't think this is any secret. Building autonomous vehicles is an incredibly complex process with a lot of different stakeholders coming together in the final product. A lot of us think about maybe the hardware, the components like, the LiDARs, the sensors, the software developers actually developing the software, but there are some other really interesting aspects I'd highlight here in COVID. And one is the role of simulation in testing. So simulation are basically, these are types of companies that create virtual environments in which you can test an autonomous vehicle. So basically you can still refine your different path planning and algorithms and still create scenarios that might actually even be more difficult to encounter in the real world. You can create those in a virtual environment and still refine and develop your algorithms. Now you can't correlate that to real world data, but we don't expect testing to be a long-term pause. And at some point that will resume. So there is really important simulation work still going on. And the other aspect here to think about, of course, is the commercial introduction of autonomous vehicles and just the general idea of using an autonomous vehicle, not just to carry people around, but actually to perform services. And this is, really important during COVID when we're all trying to, reduce human-to-human contact, as well as most of us are actually avoiding going to grocery stores, probably doing a little bit more online shopping. And the rising volumes in e-commerce is really putting a strain on logistics networks today. So we are seeing some really interesting use cases for autonomous vehicles emerge, which I do want to spend a few moments talking through. So the first example of using autonomous vehicles during COVID I wanted to highlight was Neolix. And for those of you following autonomous vehicles, this is probably a company and story you're familiar with. This is probably one of the first, if not the first story that I had heard and come across about autonomous vehicles being used during COVID. Essentially, Neolix is developing these small, not quite the size of a full-size vehicle, but robots which are autonomous. and have been adapting those to actually be used to do things like disinfecting public places. They've also been used to deliver food and supplies to medical personnel. So it's not just about reducing contact, but actually using them in a way to perform a really crucial public service. And this is, as I mentioned, one of the earlier success stories. They have seen orders spike, so they've made a couple of hundred vehicles today, but they said have a significant backlog after, really after the onset of the pandemic. So the other story I think that's worth mentioning is a use case actually here in the US, in Florida, where a company, Beep, was originally developing a robo-taxi service using Navia shuttles, as many services do. But in light of shelter-in-place restrictions, actually started working with a testing lab of COVID tests to actually deliver tests that have been taken to a lab to get tested. So basically, this shuttle goes back and forth between a testing site that was set up remotely and the lab where those samples are processed. And the value here is that it reduces human contact in an enclosed space with those tests, while all precautions are taken to seal the tests and prevent any dangerous viruses or materials from getting outside of the sample boxes. It's still an added layer of security, removing a human completely from that situation. Now, it's worth noting they do actually have a driver in a separate vehicle following the vehicle. After all, when we are transporting some highly dangerous hazardous materials. So it's not reducing labor per se, but it is, once again, using an existing autonomous vehicle to help reduce human contact. And the third and final example I wanted to talk about today was actually a company called Neuro, who's developing a product similar to what Neolix is developing, kind of a small vehicle, still road capable, but a small autonomous vehicle. And I mention them because throughout the COVID pandemic, they've actually still been progressing through some regulatory barriers. They were granted exceptions from the National Highway Transportation Safety Association here in the administration, here in the United States, which is a regulatory body which regulates safety features in the vehicle. And that exemption is that it doesn't have to have steering wheels or pedals to be on the road, which is one rule in the United States. While California actually removed one of their barriers, allowing it to operate a completely driverless delivery service, so it can start delivering things like food and parcels. Now, there is one big caveat here, which is due to shelter-in-place orders, it couldn't actually launch the service yet. It didn't have personnel to essentially staff the operations. After all, these are remotely monitored, and there are maintenance aspects and labor required to actually get these services off the ground. But just an example of, once again, delivering key supplies, things like food delivery as e-commerce volumes increase, but I think also a useful example of progressing through regulatory barriers despite the pandemic. So thinking about these types of services, certainly that's not a comprehensive list. There are other companies with autonomous vehicles that have been adapting them in similar ways. But what does this tell us about the outlook for autonomous vehicles? One is that across the board, the technology is not matured or scaled enough to really make an impact and solve problems with this current pandemic. That's not to say technology isn't progressing. When we look at autonomous vehicles and how they perform in the Lux Tech signal, it's very strong. And just a quick background for those of you that might not be familiar, the Lux Tech signal is really an algorithm that we've created that looks at a lot of different data sources ranging from patents to VC funding toward academic publications and some other proprietary data sets that we've trained to be a leading indicator of technology adoption. And really across the board, all metrics, autonomous vehicles remain a very high interest in an area where a lot of companies and individuals are focused on. But the scale is an issue. So Neolix actually was one of the few companies that has been raising funding during COVID and raised funding to more quickly scale up production, but just raised $29 million, which isn't enough to dramatically scale production in a very short time period. And additionally, they've only sold a couple of hundred vehicles to date. So we're not talking about a large enough scale of production to make an impact and deploy solutions on a wide scale. And similarly, it's not mature enough. I think, I included a quote from Ford here because they're typically one of the more conservative automakers in terms of the claims and timelines they talk about. Even they said they overestimated timelines for self-driving vehicles. It's an incredibly complex problem to solve. It's not impossible when we start thinking about self-driving vehicles operating in more constrained spaces like geofencing. But suffice to say, the technology is just not mature enough today to deploy on a wide scale. If COVID happened 5 years in the future, in 2025, I think this might be a very different conversation. But the reality is it's not mature or scaled enough to today. And I think the other thing we can take away from COVID and autonomous vehicles is the fact that these use cases demonstrating valuable services that autonomous vehicles provide should start to move the needle on public perception and perception among local regulators. This is one of the fuzzier barriers to try and quantify, but people are generally skeptical of autonomous vehicles. There are regional variations, that's less true in Asia and China versus, the United States and Europe. But people are generally skeptical of driving with or getting in an autonomous vehicle. And seeing some of these use cases of vehicles operating and performing valuable services during the pandemic is actually a good way to probably impact public opinion in a positive way. But more crucially, with greater acceptance, we would expect local governments to really take note of some of these early pilots. And as they build in more robust pandemic response plans for the future, I would not be surprised to see more of cities, countries, regions integrating things like smaller autonomous vehicles to perform, deliver services, perform things like disinfecting public spaces, start to build in autonomous vehicles to those pandemic response plans. So wrapping up autonomous vehicles, really when we, and bringing this graphic back to share our views on this, once again, it is a relatively minor but negative short-term outlook. As I mentioned, testing was halted, development was slowed, although it wasn't halted. But really some of the use cases that are likely going to emerge after the pandemic in terms of more cities being open to testing, a public being more accepting of it, it probably bodes well for the long-term outlook of autonomy. And will continue from the mid to long term to accelerate as really the learnings from increased testing start to compound. So lastly, talking about mobility as a service, or this broad umbrella of shared mobility services. And I'll say right now, it's hard to really draw broad conclusions about this space. There are a lot of different types of services included in this. Some are negatively, some are positively impacted. It really varies by not only the type of service, but we've seen impacts vary within an industry like micromobility. Impacts actually vary on a company by company level. So I'll first start by very briefly introducing the kind of framework that Lux uses to talk about different types of shared mobility services before discussing how they're going to be impacted by COVID. So we group kind of clusters of different types of similar business models together within shared mobility by asking two questions. The first is, who is actually owning the asset being shared? Conventionally in the topic of shared mobility, car rental companies are one of the oldest forms of shared mobility that have been around for over a century. The model of essentially owning a fleet of assets and renting those out is more or less established on the top row here. But on the bottom, what's emerged more really with kind of the internet economy and the sharing economy is peer-to-peer platforms that really just facilitate a sharing of assets, mobility assets like cars, bikes, scooters, et cetera, between individuals. The other question we ask ourselves is, what is the user or consumer actually responsible for doing in these business models? Are they simply a passenger consuming mobility as kind of a true service, or is there some element of navigation or operation of that vehicle that they have to take control of? And we've mapped on some of the different types of services. There's certainly a more exhaustive list, but these are really the key ones we think about. And thinking about how COVID's going to change some of these, broadly moving in toward the upper right quadrant, you're going to see more negatively impacted by COVID. Really when you think about the types of services where you own an asset and the user's a passenger, you're talking about expensive, large assets, rail, aviation, other forms of public transportation like subways. And from a perspective of social distancing, you're talking about a large number of people in a confined space, which is pretty much the worst case scenario. And these are the sectors that have been really the hardest hit in terms of changes in ridership due to COVID. And so, if we look at kind of the other aspect of this plot, things like car sharing, in theory, this is kind of the perfect business model for a pandemic. It can be fully contactless. I don't know how many of you have used these types of services. I know I've used services like Turo and GetAround. They can be fully contactless, so you never see the person you're borrowing a car from, and which is, really a really good business model these times, with the big caveat that really mobility is declining. People don't need cars. Work travel has declined. So unfortunately, though it's an industry kind of well-tailored and business model well-tailored to allowing for social distancing, its overall demand has seen a significant decrease. But I want to spend most of the time taking a deeper dive into two specific segments, which are probably the most popular, which is micromobility, so things like dockless bikes and scooters, as well as ride-hailing companies. Now, we'll start with ride-hailing companies. It's probably the first service that a lot of us think about within shared mobility. Looking back when Uber was founded roughly a decade ago, these were the types of services that were really the first to emerge. And the obvious take is that, the obvious outcome from COVID is that fewer people are traveling and these companies have taken a really big hit. I pulled a few data points from Uber. As a public company, they share a little bit more about some of their impacts than maybe others around the world, like Grab, Gojek, Didi, or some others. But Uber is reporting significant drops in demand for ride-hailing services in cities, as high as 70% in some. They're reporting massive quarterly losses. So Uber had really targeted Q4 of this year as the first quarter they could achieve profitability. Clearly, that's not going to happen at this point, and recorded one of their largest quarterly losses ever in Q1. And as a result, like most industries, they're looking to cut jobs as they're being squeezed financially. But then this really curious thing happened in the middle of all this, which is, if Uber's performing so poorly, why did it invest quite a significant amount of money, $170 million, into the largest bike sharing network in the world, Lime? And it's worth maybe just taking a quick detour to talk about micromobility to answer that question. And the reality is, micromobility has been a sector that was in a bit of a fragile state even before COVID. The brief history of micromobility is that early success was defined by massive funding rounds, rapid expansion into new markets, with little regard for local regulations. So it's often a case where, with these dockless bike and scooter companies, the mentality of it's better to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission. And to, I know at least within the case here of Boston, essentially these bikes and scooters just show up overnight in a community. And certainly that had a negative impact on the relation a lot of these companies had with local communities. That's kind of laid onto the fact that, and basically the environment before COVID was, as a lot of these companies were already exiting some markets due to unprofitability. COVID is nearly exposing this fragility. Now, I mentioned the variance wasn't just across industries or types of services, it's by individual companies. And we certainly saw this in micromobility. Some companies actually preemptively pulled scooters from the market, thinking that shared assets were not good to deploy in certain markets during a pandemic. But the reality is, if you're trying to identify a form of mobility in an urban setting that promotes social distancing, dockless bikes and scooters are actually really valuable assets. And some of the smarter companies that spend more time focusing on working with local governments actually identified that they were critical services. So some of these companies actually pulled revenues out at a really crucial time, and really kind of shot themselves in the foot from that perspective. So back to our question about Uber. If they're performing so poorly, why did they invest in Lime? Well, one was it was a discount too good to pass up. They invested in Lime at an 80% discount compared to their valuation at roughly this time last year, falling from over $2 billion to roughly about $500 million in terms of its valuation. So Uber is really taking advantage of the fact that there's a significant discount on hand here. It also used the move to offload its Jump subsidiary. So it transferred ownership of Jump, which was a Lime competitor it had acquired a couple of years ago, and actually offloaded that to Lime. And the benefit here was that, Lux doesn't believe that Jump was profitable. They're getting an unprofitable business off of its balance sheets while still actually retaining some ownership over that asset. So Lime is still going to be integrated into Uber's application. And something that wasn't as widely noted, even for those of us that did see this news item, is that there does appear to be an option for Uber to acquire Lime in a couple of years. So certainly Uber is not moving away from bike sharing in any way, but it's taking advantage of severe discounts on offer and valuations during COVID to strengthen it. And lastly, I mentioned the option to buy Lime as well, which is really crucial. And actually, part of that decision is the fact that Uber stock was involved in this deal. And this brings us to maybe another curious fact, which is the fact that Uber stock price really hasn't been significantly impacted by COVID. Investors largely seem to have a lot of confidence in Uber. And it may seem ironic, but really a lot of these ride-hailing giants have a diversity in their portfolio of services that, things like oil and gas companies would really probably really highly value right now. The lack of diversity across portfolios is what caused that drastic drop in oil prices. So the advantage of ride-hailing companies which have invested in fintech, like Grab and Gojek have pursued aggressively, or Uber's move into food delivery, which has spiked significantly this year, have been major advantages. So, broadly, something we haven't talked about yet is that, COVID will accelerate consolidation in the shared mobility industry. The hardest hit companies are going to be the smaller players that were focused on maybe one specific application, opening up opportunities for acquisition of maybe some of the larger companies, the larger ride-hailing giants that have already a diverse portfolio of services. It may even actually provide an opportunity for industries outside of their core expertise to enter a space. Think of the Amazon Zoox example I gave. Amazon stock is doing well. They're still seeing a lot of increase in demand from rising e-commerce volumes. And for them, they've moved into electrification of their fleet and looked at Zoox as really kind of the perfect opportunity to invest in a complement to that, which is autonomous driving. And, I'm certainly not going to sit here today and say that Amazon is going to invest in a ride-hailing company, but if it were going to, now is really the right time. So kind of summarizing mobility as a service here, I've broken out the impacts into a few different sectors because it's really difficult to really put one metric on the topic of mobility as a service. Things like food delivery, I'm seeing, of course, a dramatic increase in short-term spikes. And like I mentioned, is really the lifeline for a lot of these ride-hailing companies. And long-term will probably have a lasting effect. People ordering more food will probably see them ordering more food long-term. Others like micromobility is probably a more interesting story. A lot of the fleets have been reduced in the short term, and there are fewer people needing their services in the short term. But the reality is when people do start returning to work, there's going to be an aversion toward public transportation. And micromobility provides a really promising way to actually practice social distancing while still enabling transit. So we expect those personal forms of mobility to have a benefit in the mid and long term. Whereas ride-hailing, it's a negative impact right now. And really we see that kind of returning to normal slowly over time as more people start to engage in, more work travel and return to a case of business as usual. So wrapping up, before we open it up for questions, a few key takeaways from today's discussion. I think everything falls under the umbrella of, from a long-term perspective, we don't expect to have COVID to have significantly long-term impacts. In the case of electrification, it probably won't necessarily impact the percentage of new vehicle sales that are electric, but the decrease in volume means fewer electric vehicles are going to be sold in the near term. But as I mentioned, those regulators are still putting in place policies to ensure automakers continue to focus on producing zero-emission vehicles. From an autonomy perspective, there's going to be a short-term negative impact, not from vehicle sales like electrification, but from just the pace of development with limited applications for testing and people working from home and somewhat reduced headcount for staff. But these new use cases that are going to emerge after COVID that we expect cities to start implementing and open up testing a little bit more should garner crucial regulatory support and actually accelerate development and maybe shorten some timelines for autonomy long term. And lastly, the decrease in valuations that some companies are seeing and really the lack of funding that is available from some of the corporate partners is really going to accelerate consolidation across all sectors. These low valuations are going to be tempting to a lot of existing companies in the space that are looking to bolster their position, or as I mentioned, some folks in other industries, companies that may be in a strong position that look toward what industries are hurting right now, and where can they potentially invest to have a good position in the future. So with that, we'd now like to open it up to any questions that folks may have.
All right, thank you so much, Christopher, for the sharing. Since I'm the moderator for today, I'm going to exercise my right to ask the first few questions before we let the audience ask a question. So just bear with me for a while. Actually, because mobility is a topic that is very close to my heart as well, and I really have this question, a few questions that with the change in the societal mobility behavior, we are actually seeing a drastic drop in the ridership of public transport globally. And some markets like China, Taiwan are actually reporting a rise in private vehicle sales after their lockdown or alive. Do you expect to shift from public transport to more personalized transport options such as a private vehicle ownership, ride-hailing, or even a shared or micro-mobility option? And what does this mean, this shift means for mobility startup?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. It really depends on the timelines we're talking about. If I'm thinking about the next, 3 to 5 years, I think it's very fair to say public transportation ridership is probably going to remain declining, even when people are going back to work. It's pretty clear that those, as I mentioned, are the types of environments that are some of the worst to be in. Long term, if you're trying to move people in an urban environment, it's pretty clear that having a high throughput a form of public transportation, things like subways, is really how you move large volumes of people in an urban setting. And you can't replace that with things like cars and ride hailing. So I would expect it long term to return to normal. The question is, of course, what's going to replace that? Bikes and scooters is probably the early initial answer. We've seen in New York City, we've seen bike and scooters usage increase in the time since the lockdown started. Whereas, ride hailing is just simply, it's a cost issue. It's not really an effective form of, daily transportation.
All right, thank you so much. So I see a hand from Aravind. So Aravind, you are allowed to talk. You can unmute yourself to voice the question.
Thanks, Ryan and Christopher. Thanks for that presentation. I had a question on the micromobility side, particularly slide 45. You mentioned 3 of the reasons for the growth of micromobility: large funding rounds, rapid expansion, and little regard for regulation, right? So I also noticed in the subsequent Lux signal, you mentioned that in the mid to long term, you expect micromobility to have to play a major role. But since these regulations are not going to be relaxed after COVID, why does Lux come to the conclusion that there would be a bigger role for micromobility to play if regulation was speed blocked in the first place?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of reasons for that. So my first would be kind of a similar response I gave to the last question, which is we do expect micromobility to take on some of the ridership of people that aren't using public transport. But the other reason is, really in those early days of shared mobility, where companies were moving into cities with little regard for local regulations, we're starting to see that balance out a little bit. Cities have had time to assess the impact for micromobility in terms of, how do you incorporate different types of regulations, like restrictions around where you can park vehicles, what times of day they can be allowed to be used. And they're starting to set up, task forces and commissions which give permits out for who can operate. So some of those issues with regulatory bodies in the early days are being overcome currently. So between more riders coming away from public transit and kind of overcoming some of the initial regulatory challenges, I think that's why we ultimately see, longer term micromobility having a positive impact.
Okay, I had one more question, Ryan, if you would allow me.
Sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So the other question was regarding the autonomous vehicles, Neuro. That was a good example you brought up. Could you speak a little more about, I didn't quite get why they weren't able to deploy during this COVID period. Could you talk a bit more about the company and yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really just practical concerns. I don't know the exact number, but there are restrictions, were restrictions at the time of that approval around the number of people that could gather at one time. Like there are a lot of restrictions around the world, and simply the people required to maintain, operate those vehicles was not something they felt they could launch under those restrictions. So they are looking toward launching that service as soon as essentially larger gatherings are allowed, which should probably be a short-term development.
Okay.
All right, thank you so much. We have a question from François. François, would you like to voice your question live?
Sure. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
All right. Okay, hi. So my question would be about the regional differences that you would see across the world for this major trend you have described. So do you see big differences between, for instance, Asia, US, or Asia, Europe, which are by nature very different, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, I'll start with electrification. I think there are going to be regional differences. It really comes from a policy perspective where the United States is going in the opposite direction. The current administration is trying to loosen restrictions around emissions. And really, if you look at the United States as an automaker, there's really not any incentive or reason to build electric vehicles right now. All the incentive is on building larger, more profitable combustion-based vehicles. So in that sense, in the US, there probably is a more negative impact than other regions. Whereas, as I mentioned, examples of Asia and Europe seem to broadly be supporting post-COVID policies of really reinforcing development of electric vehicles and sales of electric vehicles. Within autonomy, I don't think there would be significant regional differences. Broadly, Asia and North America, specifically China and the United States, are where the vast majority of testing already occurs. Testing outside of those two countries is somewhat limited. Some of it does exist, but on a more limited scale. We do expect those countries to be a little bit ahead of others in terms of putting regulations in place that will offer autonomy. And lastly, in terms of shared mobility, I think there are probably going to be less regional differences within shared mobility compared to others, just because, as I mentioned, really the drivers are not as much regulatory as they are, things like avoiding public transit, using food delivery to reduce human contact, which are, really things that are taking place on any region today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have a few questions at the Q&A column. Chris, would you like to answer the question live?
Yes, I can bring those up. So we have one. Do you think COVID will also change the way mobility is designed in terms of disease transmission? I think, if I understand it correctly, it's really about, how do you design mobility to mitigate disease transmission? I know we've seen some companies look more at antiviral, antimicrobial surfaces. That's been really important. I know a couple of scooter companies have actually already integrated antimicrobial self-cleaning handlebars and brake handles. But I think a lot of it's going to be practical from just increased cleaning schedules and things of that nature. Looking through some of these other questions, I think some of them we've more or less answered, like what is the role of micromobility in a post-COVID world? We do have a question, it looks like, on EV charging infrastructure. So charging infrastructure for EVs is quite correlated to the adoption of electric vehicles. I think it is growing slower than EV adoption rate. What is your view of such infrastructure companies? Yeah, so I guess kind of separate from COVID maybe, it's pretty challenging to make money from deploying a vehicle charging network. And a lot of automakers have tried to take that on internally. We might see more of them in a COVID environment trying to look at not taking ownership over charging. It's an expensive asset to invest in. And I think, in terms of how quickly it's growing compared to EVs, it is a little bit slower, but it's something long-term we do expect investments to really shore up challenges. And it's important to remember the vast majority of people charge at home or at work. So public infrastructure doesn't need to be as robust as I think a lot of people think it needs to be. And then the last question here on the Q&A chat, do we see drone usage increasing post-COVID? Yeah, that's actually a really good point. I'm glad you brought up drones. So Lux did, when we started looking at autonomous vehicles for delivery, we compared them to things like drones, as well as other types of kind of other sidewalk robots that might be used. The challenge with drones is, of course, range. How much range do you get out of delivering a parcel? A lot of these drones are operating within maybe 15 to 20 miles of a warehouse. So, in short, there is an opportunity to use drones. And we do see them as being a part of last mile delivery, but they're somewhat limited in the types of use cases they can be used. But I do think it falls into the bucket of, reducing a human-to-human contact, and we'll continue to see interest moving forward.
All right, thank you so much. We have a question from, actually we have a few more questions, but because the time is up, so I'm just going to ask Chris if you're okay to continue answering a question after we close this session. Is okay for you?
Yeah, I have a few extra minutes for the extra questions.
Okay, so I'm just going to make a few announcements before we come back to the Q&A. So thank you so much for those who are attending today's sessions, and thank you, Chris, for the insightful sharing on how the mobility sector needs to pivot in a post-COVID world. For those who need to go, thank you so much. We will continue the Q&A after the closing. So at the end of this webinar, there will be a survey form for you to give feedback to enhance our future webinar. So please kindly help us to improve the webinar or organization topic and so on. So please follow us on EcoLabs linking page and join us live next Monday, 1st of June at 3:30 p.m. Singapore time for the next EcoLabs webinar series on why smart IoT requires authentication. The speakers will be from Infinio Technology, Mr. Dan Cheng Wei, Strategic Director, and Mr. Chu Woon Fo, Marketing Manager for Distribution and Partnership Alliance. So meanwhile, for those who need to go, please stay at home, be safe and healthy. Thank you so much. All right, so let's come back to the Q&A. I have a question from Nathaniel. You're allowed to talk. You can actually unmute yourself and voice your question.
Hi, Chris. Hi, Ryan. Okay, so actually I have some questions like...
Hi, we can't hear you very clearly. Your voice is a bit soft.
So for the electric vehicles, many governments are giving subsidies to encourage the use of such vehicles. But eventually when EVs become mainstream, these subsidies will definitely die off because there will not be that need to convince people to switch from diesel or switch from petrol when, but this is much more later into the future. But I just want to ask, like, when do you think that these subsidies will come to an end? Like roughly in what year?
Yeah, the answer is going to vary by region. I would say broadly, it's fair to say and set the expectations that 5 years down the road from now, you're probably operating in an environment where there won't be subsidies directly available. China's moved their goalposts a little bit from 2021 to 2023. Europe, it's a bit more difficult because each country has their different scheme. But in the US, some companies are already having to phase out subsidies. It's a little bit different. It's based on how many vehicles you've sold to date. So each automaker hits that point at a different period of time. But broadly, I think a lot of governments, wouldn't be able to support subsidy schemes beyond maybe 5 years. I mean, we start thinking about the volumes of vehicles that we expect to be electric is pretty significant. It would be very expensive to operate a subsidy program. So shifting toward, maybe higher penalties and higher fees for combustion engine vehicles, or penalties and fees to automakers, not just people buying cars, is probably how they will make that transition.
Yeah, actually, I still have a few more questions, so I hope you don't mind. So yeah, is that okay with you?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead.
Yeah, because actually, when you were answering the previous question, I hear that you mentioned about the extra costs that charges might be much more expensive. So actually, I have a similar viewpoint about this, because I noticed that for our bus infrastructure here, for our e-bus infrastructure here in Singapore, we actually, I believe that we are spending unnecessarily on it, because we actually had a procurement for Euro 6 double-decker buses, and in my opinion, it is the maintenance that would ensure the cleanliness and these emissions are up to the standards. So EVs come with an extra cost, like the software to mitigate the range anxiety issues, and also the battery servicing. So another point about EVs is that because EVs technically they do not pollute the environment. So when we want to bridge the topics of electric vehicles and public transport, we cannot really say that you cannot buy EVs because they are polluting the environment. So therefore, this might cause an issue of congestion. So I'm not sure if you have any views about how to mitigate congestion, because if we have too many EVs, we will have congestions.
Yeah, I think, I think that the big point is around probably electric buses, and the fact that, it's just a different cost structure. It's more expensive upfront for the vehicle, but usually there's a payback period of maybe 3 to 4 years. And what has been actually really interesting in the e-bus space is actually some of the innovative financing models. So some of the big bus companies in the space, like someone like Proterra in the US, I know they're not the only one, are actually investigating battery leasing models, where essentially a transit agency wouldn't buy the bus or the charging infrastructure. They would only buy the bus, not the battery, the charging infrastructure, and they would lease the infrastructure and the batteries kind of on an ongoing basis. So basically, it's a capital cost structure which fits within their needs, and they're actually still, even with paying a battery lease on a monthly basis, they're still saving a little bit of money compared to what they were paying on maintenance and fuel costs. So I think, I don't think there's going to be a mass transition away from things like buses toward personal car ownership, because I think transit agencies are getting pretty excited about buses.
Yeah, so just to
Alright, so
wrap
just
up.
let me interject for
yeah,
this.
sure.
So answering your question about the congestion between electric vehicles and having more vehicles on the road, Singapore approach has always been in a car-like society, where the majority of the transport should be happening on public transport, and that's why in a study that was issued, I think in 2017, the opportunity for pollution reductions on the mobility sector actually lies in the public transport, where you electrify public buses will actually have a better reduction in terms of CO2 emissions compared to private vehicle. This is also why Singapore, as a country, the policy direction is moving this direction. We have one more question from the audience. If you don't mind, let me get to David. David, would you like to answer the question live? Ask the question live. Okay, maybe David, it's not convenient to ask a question live, so I'll ask the question. So David's question is, in Singapore, young people no longer dream of the prestige of owning a car, and he suspects that this is the case for many other countries. So what are the major societal mindset shifts in mobility, especially in our new generation?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. Admittedly, I have not, Lux hasn't done a lot of work in this subject area, but I am familiar with some researchers at MIT who have looked at this and actually used the term car pride as something they factor into some of their forecasts around different mobility modes. So I'll plug someone else's research, the MIT Insights into the Future of Mobility. It's a very long 150-page multi-year study around mobility that I'd highly recommend. And they did recognize that this is a challenge in terms of pushing getting massive populations to move away from car ownership to just consume mobility as a service. And their findings were broadly that a lot of forecasts are probably undercounting that impact that car pride has. Interestingly, they did note, of course it was lower in younger populations, but also car pride was significantly higher as an impact in developing nations. So they looked at a lot of locations like throughout Africa and Southeast Asia that were really considered as high metrics for car pride, whereas Europe, United States, other parts of the world, it was a little bit less than others. So that's kind of my depth of knowledge on that topic. But if you're really interested in the topic, I'd highly recommend. I think the researcher was Joanna Moody at MIT. She's done some really interesting work in that space.
All right, thank you so much. I think we have a very, very interactive and very insightful exchange with Christopher and all the attendees in this session. So let's come to the end of this, and thank you so much. We will share the slides and recording in our platform in YouTube and also through the attendee list. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Christopher, again for joining us to share your insight in this topic, and thank you all attendees for making this a very interactive and insightful exchange. So thank you so much. Take care and have a good weekend ahead. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.